Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 27th, 2023. It's Friday, so I asked for your questions and I sure got them. In fact, I'm a little overwhelmed by the number that I received, and I obviously don't have the time in today's update to cover all of them, but I picked out a couple that I think reflect more generally some of the questions that are coming up, especially as the situation is becoming more tense internationally around the decision to send the Leopard tanks to Ukraine, the merger of the European Union and NATO, the global NATO direction, and so on. So I'll be taking them up, but I would encourage people on Saturday. There'll be a Manhattan Project meeting, and I'll be joining Dennis Speed to discuss these questions and many others. So you can get that from the LaRouche Organization website, and it's at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on Saturday. Now, one of the questions that came up from a number of people is, what's the status of Europe, of NATO? Is this going to hold together? Will they remain united under NATO direction? A number of you brought up the comments from the German Foreign Minister, airhead, warhawk, Annalena Baerbock, who said, quote, "We are at war with Russia." Now, who does she mean by we? The Green Party, Germany, NATO? This was something that caused quite a stir inside Russia, as you can imagine, but also inside Germany. So this reflects the decision that was made earlier this month with a declaration from the European Union and NATO of common purpose, or in a sense, a de facto unity of purpose in the war. Now, NATO has functioned as a military arm to back up the economic policies of the Anglo-American Empire. And for those of you who still don't believe there's an Anglo-American Empire, I think you're living on the wrong planet, or you're watching too much TikTok. The reality is that the US and the British have been in lockstep increasingly over the recent years based on a long-term subversion policy of the British that goes back to the 19th century to destroy the American system and bring the United States in as a partner, with the aim to be breaking up a potential for an alliance in Europe, which could include France, Germany, and Russia. So I'll be discussing that in a few moments, but what we're seeing is the consolidation of a global NATO to defend the Unipolar Order, to organize the world around the needs of the corporate cartels, which are basically destroying the financial and economic system through indebtedness, through flooding the system with money, deindustrialization, the green policy, and so on. So there was a dual threat that was addressed at the Davos World Economic Forum by the people who support this policy, that is the unity of NATO and the European Union, on behalf of the policy of defending the cartels, destroying national sovereignty, and so on. And what they discussed was the problem of deglobalization, which means the assertion of sovereignty by poorer nations, former colonial nations, as well as bigger nations like Russia and China, and also de-dollarization. The threat of deglobalization and de-dollarization is very real. So the question is, does the fear of, quote, imperial Russia, unquote, is that enough to keep Europe together? And you hear it now increasingly, whether it's Anne Applebaum, the propagandist who writes for the Washington Post, for the Atlantic Council, people of that sort, the Keir Giles of Chatham House, who basically say Russia's an empire, it's a brutal empire. Whether it's Putin or historic Russia, it's a threat to Europe. Now, Giles, obviously, when he talks about a brutal empire, he's a British citizen. Does he not know the history of the British Empire, which is infinitely more bloody than the Russian Empire? And this British Empire exists today, although Giles and others try to pretend it doesn't. They try to pretend there's some universal value of so-called democracy, which is defended by the British and the special relationship with America. Is that enough to keep Europe in line? The defense of the Unipolar Order, which primarily benefits corporate cartels of London, Wall Street, and increasingly Brussels. So this goes back to British geopolitics. Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, the representatives of what is the Uniparty in the United States. Brzezinski was with the Democrats, and his offspring include Madeleine Albright and Tony Blinken, and Kissinger with the Republican Party. The question is, will the Republicans in the House rebel against this policy? There's an emergency memo that was released by the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, which includes prominent figures such as Ray McGovern. And I'll link that at the bottom of the description page. It's a very strong memo to Biden about the insanity of pursuing war with Russia. Now, in Europe, we're seeing signs of, let's just say, extreme uneasiness. The president of Switzerland, Berset, reaffirmed Swiss neutrality, said this is no time to change from this. There will be no missiles or weapons from Switzerland into Ukraine. And this is somewhat of a break of what seemed to be the direction of Switzerland, but he reaffirmed this idea of neutrality. In Germany, Scholz went before the Bundestag and was confronted with this policy of sending the Leopard tanks to Ukraine. From the left and the right, from the Alternative for Deutschland, the so-called right-wing party. They reminded him, and this is interesting, reminded him that his party, the Social Democrats, is the party of Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, who believed in détente with Russia, who believed in peaceful coexistence, and in fact believed that it was essential for Europe to have not just an accommodation with Russia, but trade with Russia. And so the so-called right-wing party of Germany correctly attacked Scholz for breaking from this tradition, as well as the left party, the Link party, from Sevim Dagdalen, who attacked the Greens and the Liberal Party, the Free Democrats, as neocons. And Dagdalen said they are reading from the books of Brzezinski with an intention to destroy the relationship between Germany and Russia. So the fact that this is now being discussed openly in the German parliament is a good sign. And the question is, how long will the Germans allow themselves to be pulled into the war party on behalf of the British and American and general NATO policy? In France, there's a growing rebellion against Macron. This is over the economy, his pension reform plan. But it reflects a much deeper unease over Macron's submersion of France under the control of the British and American Empire. Now, from Canada, there should be a rebellion. The Deputy Prime Minister Freeland, who has historic roots in Ukrainian Nazism through her grandfather, and his cooperation and, in fact, collaboration with the Nazis in Galicia, in Western Ukraine, when the Nazis controlled it in World War II. She told an audience at Davos, quote, "The middle class needs to decide to take a pay cut," unquote. She's not just the Deputy Prime Minister, she's also the Finance Minister. And in that statement, she showed the exact connection, the unity between the policy of the neocons and the neoliberals. Prepare for war to defend the existing order. That's what Freeland represents. And it's this question of war and austerity. That's their plan. Will a war buildup solve the economic crisis? Absolutely not. A war buildup could lead to something even more catastrophic, namely nuclear war. So that's their plan. Our plan is to oppose it. And you can join us on February 4th with our next Schiller Institute conference. There are demonstrations scheduled against the war on February 19th, but don't wait for that. Get active now. Take the VIPS letter as an example. spread this video, but join our fight to unite the opposition to the unipolar world. Now, that brings me to the second question, which is a very interesting one. Can Anglo-American financial power and military threats prevent a move away from the unipolar world? Well, that's what the Davos conference was basically designed to do, is to get a unity behind the idea that you have to crack down against the de-dollarization and de-globalization. One of the themes of Davos initially in this conference was re-globalization, but they didn't really discuss that too much. But what's the problem they have? Well, if they crack down, then it actually drives the forces closer toward breaking with the unipolar world. That is, if you seize nations' currencies, if you seize their reserves, if you prevent them from investing in their physical economy under the excuse of decarbonization, what you do is convince them that they have to assert sovereignty against the globalized policy. And we're seeing the move toward use of national currencies for trade and investment. And this is coming from across the former colonial world. It's very clear that this is the fight going on now in South America. It's clear this is the fight in Africa, where you just had Janet Yellen show up to try and tell people, don't go with China, don't go with Russia, stick with us, we'll help you. And what's Yellen offering? The US-Europe policy for Africa is solar power. It's moving away from modern industry. That's not what they want. In fact, that's not what they need. You have a crisis overall in Africa, which is that the effects of the continued neo-colonial policy of depriving them of credit, of capital goods, and so on, is occurring at the same time that nations are expanding their capability to enter, to, in a sense, leapfrog into new technologies. That's why China is so popular, and Russia also in Africa, because they're committed to such technologies as nuclear energy, high-speed rail, dam construction, all of which are off the record, off the agenda of the Europeans for Africa. They're saying Africa has to join the decarbonization. Well, so I think the pressure that's being put on the African countries, as well as Asian countries, to stick with the agenda of the globalists, that is driving many of them to at least neutrality over the Ukraine situation, but many of them are supporting Russia. And we're seeing the growth of the BRICS movement, of the other institutions such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Forum, that are moving in the direction of the policies advocated by Lyndon LaRouche of high technology, scientific investment into those technologies which increase the productivity of labor, which means no decarbonization. And this brings up the whole question of the fake science that's being used to hammer these countries into adopting policies which are against their own development. Now, this is why the real issue that should have been discussed at Davos is the depopulation policy of the globalists. That their view is that there are too many people. This was stated explicitly by Kissinger in the National Security Study Memo 200, which was classified when it came out in 1975. It said that the resources being used in the developing countries, which will be in more demand for them as their populations grow, is a detraction of what we need in the advanced sector. And therefore, population growth should be not only discouraged, but reversed. That's what the Malthusian idea is behind globalization. So this, I think, is an important point. People really need to deal with these questions of why LaRouche talked about the necessity for increases in energy flux density as the key to not just productivity gains, but to increasing the amount of total wealth available to allow for population growth and improved standard of living. That's what's under attack because the existing unipolar order can't afford to have money diverted away from its debt bubbles. And to protect those debt bubbles, they're willing to launch wars all over the world. And that's what ultimately is behind the fight in Ukraine. That Russia is not willing to give up its sovereignty, that Russia intended to protect the people of the Donbass from Ukrainian ultranationalists. And that's what this fight is about. It's not about sovereignty or democracy or improving the lifestyle of Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are the victims of the NATO policy, which is to use them against Russia because of Russia's moves toward de-dollarization and deglobalization. So this is something that, as people grasp, take this out and use this to educate the people who don't understand it yet, who think somehow we're dealing with an evil empire and a new Hitler. The evil empire is global NATO, and that's what must be stopped. So take a look at the VIPS memo that I'm going to link today and sign up to attend our February 4th Schiller Institute conference. And I'll see you next week.